Homelessness is worsening over time.
If you don't have a home, you really can't focus on other parts of your life.
Our children are our future because we are the present.
You're one really bad day away from being homeless.
Folks that you walk past on the street, they're somebody's family member.
Housing, education, people. Those are game changers. We have the money, the intellect, the passion. We can do this.
Hi, my name is Hannon, and I'm the host of The Bells I Hear, an audio and video podcast that aims to raise awareness about the homelessness crisis in New York City and the complexity surrounding the issue. Thanks so much for tuning in. So today we have Naomi Mortensen joining us. She is a community outreach director at the National Women's Shelter Network, an organization that helps women, children, and families find shelter and supportive services. And Naomi, it's so nice to have you on today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Yeah. So, just to get started, could you just tell us a little bit about your journey from Utah, where you're originally from, and to DC now?
Absolutely. So I grew up in Maryland, and I spent about half of my childhood in Saudi Arabia. And in Saudi Arabia, they have a specific approach to immigration called the kafala system. The kafala system is where, unfortunately, employers have a lot of control of your legal documentation as an immigrant, as a work immigrant. And unfortunately, that does lead into human trafficking a lot. And so growing up as a kid in Saudi Arabia, I saw a lot of in-person human trafficking, and there were several people in my community who were being trafficked. And so this was like a pretty foundational issue to me as I was growing up, just as a person, seeing it. And so when I went to Utah, and I went to Brigham Young University at Utah, I became really involved in things like the Anti-Human Trafficking Club or the Students Together Against Sexual Assault Club, because this concept of human trafficking, sex trafficking, and sexual violence was something I had seen as a kid, and it was something that I couldn't shake. I couldn't get out of my brain. And so I did a couple of academic projects revolving around victim services for something called the Global Truth Commission Index, where we were indexing human rights violations and how truth commissions would confront the aftermath of large civil conflict or major human rights violations in countries. And I focused on those victim services as a researcher and as a mentor for other researchers. After that, I became a rape crisis counselor at something called The Refuge, which used to be the Women and Children in Crisis Center, as well as I worked for a branch of the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, where we're working on rehabilitation for folks who had been sex trafficked. And after that, I interned at RAIN, which operates the National Sexual Assault Hotline. And I was on the training team, and then I was invited to come on as a contractor. I ended up being a HR training and design manager. And when I became the HR training manager for RAIN, they had me come out to DC. From there, I've had a couple of jobs, and most recently the director of community outreach at the National Women's Shelter Network.
Wow, it sounds like you sort of stayed on the trajectory of helping sex trafficking survivors. I guess what made it resonate so much with you that you kind of have made it this lifelong career of yours? Or lifelong passion?
Yeah. I talk a lot about being a survivor advocate in that I had been sexually abused as a child by a family member, and how that stuck with me, the feeling of powerlessness and the feeling of I was in it by myself. And if anyone was going to fix things, it had to be me. I had to be the one to do that. But as you come into the sphere and you see these other human rights violations, you realize you're like, I can't just be me. I have to work with others. I also have to be someone who's safe for others, and I have to be someone who's willing to sacrifice a bit for others. It doesn't mean that I have to sacrifice everything. We talk about self-sacrifice and self-care a lot in the nonprofit space, but there are elements to life that I think you can't have, such as community, with having a bit of self-sacrifice. Seeing that powerlessness, experiencing it myself, coming to understand the systems that create powerlessness and the way that we can break up those systems and empower people, that just became a central facet of my life and integral to understanding how to relate to people, how much I love other people. Instead of being afraid of people, I feel a lot of compassion for folks. Does it mean that I perfectly confront every interpersonal issue? Well, definitely not. But I have a lot of compassion for why people do what they do And if I see a systemic issue, I understand that human behavior is a response to their environment. They have autonomy, but it's largely a response to their environment. And if I want to deal with the systemic issues that we're dealing with, especially homelessness and sex trafficking, I have to think of the root causes concerning human behavior.
You talk about sort of like self-sacrifice, especially with sort of helping other people that are going through like sex trafficking or honestly anything. What does that look like self-sacrifice in those spaces?
I think there's been a popular saying the past couple of years, and it's inconvenience is the price of community. And sometimes we juggle what is inconvenience, what is self-sacrifice. And when I was younger, in my early 20s and in my late teens, it was all about quote unquote the work, like the work of anti-sexual violence. And sometimes we sacrifice what we need a little bit too much to give to that work. And so as I'm growing into my career, I understand what is willingness to be inconvenienced and what is willingness to sacrifice. And in different jobs, it looks at different things. When I was a rape crisis counselor, I had to be on call 24/7. So that means if at 2 a.m. a SANE nurse, which is a sexual assault nurse examiner, is calling me at 2 a.m. and saying, hey, I need you to come to this hospital, I'm up and I'm immediately on my way to the hospital. And so sometimes you do sacrifice a little bit of those biological needs. And that can't happen too much or else you'll absolutely run out of steam. But then there's the additional of sacrificing a bit of your comfort. That's something I think about a lot, especially as someone who isn't always comfortable just kind of coming into a situation that's really deep and sensitive and feeling like I'm inserting myself. I feel like that's very uncomfortable for me. But that's really what you have to do in this frontline work is you're coming into a situation, you don't know everything, you have to ask a lot of questions, and you're making yourself really uncomfortable sometimes. And that's the sacrifice, is that you're going to be inconvenienced in so much of this work. Maybe you do take a call on the weekend, maybe you don't. We all set those boundaries for ourselves. But in order to be a part of the anti-sexual violence movement, there is some discomfort that you will have, whether it's biologically or it's psychological.
Right. It's kind of like you have to give some part of you, right? Like your time, your energy, your expertise, whatever it is, to help other people through what they're going through, or in that case. So you mentioned that you had a personal experience. So how has that shaped your approach to the work that you're doing every day?
It shapes my approach in that I recall what it's like to be in that situation, why I acted the way that I did, how I responded in the years where I was coming to terms with what happened to me, how precarious that journey was in understanding what was happening to me. And it shapes it because I can't have room for judgment when I'm doing this work. Judgment takes up too much space of my energy, and that shapes in being non-judgmental in this work. I'm not thinking of what people should have done differently or what they should do differently now. I'm not even thinking about what they should do in the future, because I think that's too much responsibility placed on an individual. I'm thinking much more about how do we shape systems instead of individuals to create resilient systems instead of resilient individuals. Because when I was really in the thick of some post-traumatic stress, I did not have the psychological or internal tools to quote unquote heal. I recognize a lot of people say healing is internal. Yes, healing is also deeply systematic and interpersonal. And so that shapes in how I want to approach the work in creating systems that creates resilient systems, as to oppose the very popular idea of creating resilient individuals.
Yeah, no, that's important. It's kind of just like meeting people where they are and not really making assumptions or making judgments. I'm sure it really frees your minds and allows you to redirect your energy towards more important things as well. So I know you've shared with us that you've worked closely with survivors of sex trafficking and violence. Could you share a bit about how that intersects with homelessness?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I mean, the things that I usually think of is intimate partner violence. I think that's a huge intersection of why folks are homeless. I can even think of someone I know who I've known since I was a kid who she was homeless because she essentially had been sex trafficked on and off since she was a kid. And sex trafficking is unfortunately deeply correlated with intimate partner violence because often it's the partner who's doing the trafficking. She didn't have a safe place to go because a lot of these times these partners who are trafficking their significant other or just one of their many, honestly, victims is the people who live there with them, they're survivors and they're victims. They have to make money in order to sleep at that place. That happens so much where someone says, you can't come home and you can't sleep in this bed until you've made $500 today. And that's a reality, right? And so if you don't make $500 that day, sorry, maybe you're sleeping on the road. Maybe you're sleeping somewhere, right? Maybe you're heading to a shelter. Additionally, the vast majority of women who experience homelessness, they have already had some sort of sexual trauma prior to even the first bout of homelessness. It's a pretty tall number. I want to say it's about 75% of women who are homeless have experienced sexual trauma prior to being homeless.
So it sounds like this remains a really large issue. Are there any prevention strategies or things that can be done to mitigate the amount of women that are thrown into homelessness because of intimate partner violence or abuse?
Wraparound systems. I think that's the most important part is wraparound systems, right? We think a lot about there's prevention or approaches to issues like this and systemic issues. There's the prevention of the issue. There is the rapid response and intervention of the issue. And then there's the aftermath of the issue. And then there's the long-term aftermath of the issue. And so when you think about it in these distinct, about 4 different ways, you're able to create a system for each of those points of intervention, as well as if you're talking together, if you're different systems, different organizations, say you're a prevention organization, you're a hotline, you're an aftermath organization, a recovery organization, you have to be talking to each other about trends that you're seeing in real life. Because the difficult thing about these systemic issues is that they evolve and they rapidly adapt, right? But really, I also think it comes down to the fact that we live in an economic system that disadvantages folks who are not born into wealth. And I think that's one of the primary things that leads people into homelessness, because unfortunately, poverty also deeply intersects with sex trafficking. It deeply intersects with domestic violence, with sexual violence and physical violence. And it's very related to, do you have your basic needs met? Do you have food? Do you have water? Do you have a place to sleep that's safe? Do you have a support system? And typically when you're economically well off or financially well off, you don't really have to think about those things too much. And you can kind of focus on other things. And so honestly, systems that address those things, housing, poverty, food security, health, mental health, those things are going to be preventative to homelessness.
Yeah, it's all very deeply interconnected, and it's in order to solve one, you also have to tackle the other. So, what are some of the unique challenges that sex trafficking survivors face when it comes to finding stable and secure housing?
Financial and credit history. The financial and credit history is so difficult for survivors. As you can imagine, they are a gig worker / are doing what's often considered illegal work, depending on where you are and what the laws are in the region that you live in. But because their work, it's not too documented, they're not going to have a W-2, and their employer's not going to have a W-9. They don't have documentation of their work history, of their credit history, in order to apply for, these secure places to live, like in a good apartment. You typically have to put down your employer. And so much of housing is related to how you're employed and how you are off financially and the documentation of your financial history. And so when survivors of sex trafficking don't have that documentation. They can't find a safe place to live. They just kind of re-enter the cycle of, I have to go and find someone and either make money to find somewhere to live temporarily, or something called survival sex, which is where in order to have an accommodation, in order to have food, you're having sex with someone for that explicit exchange of food, accommodation, maybe a shower. And so that's a really tough obstacle that survivors of sex trafficking have. And it's really hard to do re-entry into the workforce when you don't have that quote unquote credible work history.
It does feed into the cycle because it's like you're not really learning the skills and you're not receiving the tools that you need to thrive once you are trying to exit the shelter system. I guess, how do you think that the system can be improved and can be more helpful for people that want to re-enter the workforce or find stable housing?
There are a lot of solutions that are coming out of the woodworks now, and unfortunately a lot of solutions that won't be put into practice just because of the recent federal funding cuts. I think a lot of people have a lot of different ideas, and we still have to see how they play out. There's a lot of workforce housing that people are looking into. I recently visited a shelter in Hawaii on the island of Oahu where their shelter employees paid about $300 a month for housing to live in some pretty nice accommodations on campus. And so that was a solution because not only were those employees of shelters, they often were an alumnus of a shelter. They themselves had been homeless. And so they were able to pay minimal rent, save up some money, gain some financial credit and credible financial history so that they could apply for apartments after maybe a year or two of living in this really rent-stabilized accommodation. And so things like workforce housing, they can have really positive effects, I think, so long as you are not exploiting your workers. But then there's also the fact of we just need to stabilize rent. I think rent caps are incredibly important. I think folks also get around rent caps in unfortunate legal ways, right? I think it's like if you own in DC, I'm thinking about if you own less than 10 or 5 units, you don't have to have a rent cap. And so there are these ways around stuff like that. And exactly. And so tamping down on that, I think that's really going to help folks have the stability to stay in an area. There's also gentrification. I think avoiding gentrification of areas where people have lived forever. I'm out in North Basin, D.C. a lot for my volunteer work as a court-appointed professional advocate. And as I watch these high-rises develop out there, I'm also watching my clients be priced out of the places that they've lived for decades. Even almost 2 or 3 centuries, some of these folks have lived there since D.C. grew over the past couple hundred years. So did, honestly, the folks who were living in the Northeast and those areas. And so we have to be really careful about how we zone and how we gentrify certain areas where people, they can't afford to live there anymore. And they get pushed out and pushed out and pushed out of the city.
Yeah, I noticed it. Well, I've definitely noticed it a lot in New York City, and especially like in my own neighborhood as well, where they're building these like luxury buildings, but like the members of the community are earning like, less than $50K. Like they definitely don't qualify for, living there. So it's inevitable that they'll be priced out and displaced, which everything kind of just like works in tandem to sort of push people outside to the curb, which is really frustrating and also scary to think about the direction that we're headed in.
There's a documentary that our team was invited to preview last year called Fault Lines. And it was about a couple of different stories. I think it was Section 8 housing out in San Francisco. NIMBYs, not in my backyard folks, as well as the zoning commissions, the folks who were called NIMBYs in a certain neighborhood because they didn't want certain Section 8 permanent housing built out there. And what I learned through the documentary, that one of the reasons that these folks turn to high-rise luxury apartments is because it's not profitable. The way that zoning and construction policies are set up in certain cities is that why would I build an affordable apartment complex when it's not profitable? Because the time it takes to build that complex, as well as the fees it takes, it's going to take a builder out, right? They don't have the financial means for that. So they have to go in and build these luxury high-rises if they want to make profits, as well as folks in certain neighborhoods don't want people to have experienced homelessness in the neighborhoods. Right. It's largely associated with drugs, unwanted social behaviors, etc. And so people see Section 8 housing, or people see rent stabilized housing, and they have a very certain idea about the people who are going to live there.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah, we can only hope that I don't know, that things do get better and that there's more, that they implement more affordable housing. I don't know, the fabric of the city. I'm sure other cities as well, it's changing. And yeah. Is there, throughout, your career, a particular person or sort of story that has stuck with you?
I work with a lot of kids, and it's going to make me tear up. I've worked with a lot of kids for a long time, and watching children over the years experience some of the most traumatic things from as young as, a year old. I think someone that I worked with was sex trafficked as young as a year old. And watching them go through life feeling so lonely and so uncomfortable in their own body, and trying so many different ways to live a normal life, to have a job, to have relationships. But the biological and also just social factor of feeling unsafe and how that's affected them throughout their life, I think that sticks with me a lot, because this particular individual, I mean, I've watched her go through these relationships, and many of them have been very exploitative relationships and even survival sex. I kind of like dropped the professional demeanor and was trying in a more personal and individual way to help this person. And she kind of didn't want the help that I was going to give. And even as a professional who's seen that all the time, there's this internal pain of being like, I know why you're refusing my help. It makes sense. But it's also just so painful, because I'm going to be here, and the best thing I can do is just stay in connection with you, and you can know that I'm here. I can send you $5 or $10 every now and again. But I also know that you're going to go through some things, and you're going to experience certain life experiences that I can't take away from you, and I can't stop you from having. And it just reminds me, okay, go back, create better systems. You cannot change individuals. You just can't. You can love them. You can show them compassion. You cannot change their behavior. You can change their environment. You can create better systems. You can create more resilient networks. You can create better professionals and develop better professionals. You cannot change individuals. And that has stuck with me. It's the reason why I don't take a very individualist accountability kind of take. I don't place a lot of accountability on individuals as much as some people think that folks should, just because watching so many of these stories where you try to change the individual, ultimately you're going to fail if you take that approach, because people have autonomy and people's experiences are their. And so if you come in and say, I'm going to change your life, I think that's really arrogant. And I think that it makes someone feel lonelier, and it makes them feel like a bit of a failure. Her case, as well as several others who have been almost exactly like that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's crazy to think at like 1 year old or 1 year old experiencing that, and like how that might impact just the way they see the world, the way they move through the world. And yeah, I mean, you can only help someone as much as, they are wanting to be helped. So I think that was important for you to emphasize as well. So was there ever a moment that made you realize like the urgency of the homelessness crisis, and even just like the sex trafficking crisis in the United States, in D.C., wherever, you've been?
I guess I have kind of two routes of an answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
The first is the fact that my family experienced housing insecurity, even as a young child. Up until we moved to Saudi Arabia, we were on and off experiencing housing insecurity. And, my dad had 3 degrees by the time I was 9 or 10. Like, this is a very smart, educated man who works very hard, had a great resume, still struggled to find stable work in the area that he was in. He would go out, he would toss newspapers, he was a window cleaner, right? Again, 3 degrees. And like one of them was an EMPA, where it's very applicable to many aspects of several industries, and still struggling to find financial stability there. And so as a kid, I understood that I'm deeply privileged. The reason we weren't homeless was because our family took us in at different times into their homes. And so I was very privileged to have that kind of network. Second was I lived in some great areas in Maryland. And so I was privileged to have access to certain resources and a good education. The other was honestly the fact that I'm white, right? And people perceive me in a different way. Sometimes people perceive me as being a bit smarter than I am, or fitting a standard that they like. And so they're willing to give me more of a chance at work. And so I was very aware, especially heading into Saudi Arabia, of the fact that I was so deeply privileged and given some unfair advantages just by the nature of something as scriptive as how I look, and that my family still experienced housing insecurity. And that was very poignant to me growing up. But then there's the fact of a second maturation as I became an adult, and you start interacting more on a professional level with people on the street, and you start talking to them a bit more and learning their stories. And it was things like talking to someone who has half of a foot because they don't have the money to treat their diabetes. Talking to someone who all of their fingers were gone because, again, diabetes. And so talking to these folks who, yes, they had been physically disabled, but that physical disablement also worked in conjunction with social disability, and that we socially disable people just as much as we physically disable them by restricting access to life-saving medicine. And so growing up as someone who experienced housing insecurity and then coming into a professional world where I was seeing people who couldn't physically get out of homelessness themselves, and that they were everywhere. They're here in D.C. I saw them in Seattle. I've seen them in L.A. I've seen them in Houston, Texas, where I worked for a little bit. Everywhere I go, I see these folks, and recognizing it's a chronic issue that exists everywhere. We're not going to escape it anytime soon unless we take critical action.
Yeah, it's like these people are like can't receive medical help because they probably can't afford it, or it's out of reach. And then it's like now you're in the situation where you're homeless and people view you a certain way and don't want to help you, maybe because of the way that you look. And it's just this never-ending cycle of feeling helpless and feeling like you've been like somewhat banished or like, I don't know, sort of marginalized from society. And it's like all you really needed from the start was help, just someone to like see you and come in and help you. How did that make you feel, or what sort of emotions rose as you sort of realized that?
It's such a mixed bag. I often don't actually feel powerless because I'm just willing to take a lot of action in my life. I think that's something I learned growing up, having been abused, is that I, in fact, can do things. I can take action. Am I going to solve all of it? No. Can I take action? Yeah, I can. I'm absolutely going to take action. But then comes the debilitating mix of just sorrow, a lot of sorrow for seeing how people are treated just by other people. It's one thing to watch these natural disasters come in, almost feeling unavoidable because it's something so much bigger than you are. And it's another thing to watch people hurt other people's on a wide scale. And so sometimes, you know, when I'm tired, I can't do something about it. Sitting with that and going, okay, like I'm feeling all of these emotions. I'm feeling anger. I'm feeling rage. I'm feeling disconnected from people because it's so hard to watch that sometimes you psychologically disconnect from it because it's overwhelming. And having to sit with that and say, yeah, this is part of the experience. This is It's not the driver behind what I do, but it's definitely a puzzle piece of saying, I don't think that these emotions at this time, we don't have to be this way, right? It doesn't have to be this way. And so sitting with those big emotions, I think, is a big part of having compassion for other people and recognizing that biological reaction of having sorrow and anger is because I can empathize and because I do see you as very human and just as deserving as I am of rights. And so if I'm able to contextualize those tough emotions in that way and remember that those emotions can be connective instead of disconnective, that helps me take a second, take a beat, come back to it, and I come back to the table and I go, okay, I'm ready. Let's go.
No, that's wonderfully put. It's like you care. Like these emotions are happening because you care, and they're not a bad thing whatsoever. What's one misconception about homelessness that you wish more people understood?
There was actually some discourse in the community, the service providers, of, people say you're one paycheck away from homelessness, and the fact is that that's not true. You're not one paycheck away from homelessness because some people have these immense amount of savings and do have an immense amount of financial capital that they're able to expend, or even political capital that they won't experience homelessness. I will say everyone is one very bad, no good day away from being homeless. One very bad, no good day. Maybe it's a natural disaster. Maybe it's some very unfortunate accident. Yeah. Everyone is one very bad, no good day away from being homeless. And people think that they're safe from that. And some people think that they would never be homeless. And I would caution that kind of hubris of saying they would never be homeless, because you could be. We all could be homeless in 24 hours based on something terrible happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it literally could happen to anybody in the blink of an eye. So what does home mean to you?
A safe place to sleep. I come back to when I was being abused by that family member. I didn't have a safe place to sleep. The room that I was often in when I was over there, the door didn't lock, and it was right next to his room. And so even on nights where he wouldn't come in, I would just look at that door handle and wait for it to open until I fell asleep. And so I never really got the important sleep that I needed. And sleep was a tough time for me because sleep wasn't a safe place. A bed wasn't a safe place. It was a place where I didn't know what was going to happen next in it. And so home, honestly, for me, is a safe place to sleep where if I don't want someone to touch me, they're not going to touch me. And I think that's one of the reasons that the NWSN has our Safe Sleep campaign, where we're working on doing makeovers for shelters to create better environments and conditions for people to have that psychologically necessary, good quality sleep. And that's something I wholeheartedly think about. My home is where I go to rest safely.
No, that's wonderfully put. Yeah, it's somewhere where you just don't have to worry, sort of just somewhere safe, stable, and secure. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So I know you mentioned NWSN. What sort of drew you to working there specifically?
It's funny. I'd kind of taken a break from the anti-sexual violence nonprofit industry. It had been heavy for a while, and I knew that I needed just to refresh a little bit. So I was working for a legal association, and I got some great experience there that was really necessary. While I was working at that legal association, Constant Collins was in D.C. at the time because we've been working on some federal legislation called the Women and Family Protection Act. She's in D.C., and someone I knew had let her know that I could do a job that she wanted to be done at the NWSN. And so she reached out to me. She said, "Hi, I'm Constant Collins. This is the National Women's Shelter Network. This is what we do. And this is the position I think you might be able to take. Why don't you come talk to me?" And I remember sitting at breakfast We had early coffee with Constance while she was in the city. And she was just, who she was so apparent in that moment. It wasn't a mask. It wasn't fake. She was warm in the way that, like, the core of her is just a good person. And the way that she talked about people experiencing homelessness, it gave them so much dignity. They call their folks at the Lotus House that she started, 20 years ago, visitors and alumni. It's a very warm feeling about how she talks about her folks. And so I already was missing the anti-sexual violence movement, and I was already missing just honestly, like, being part of that sphere in general. And so when she came in and we had that coffee, and she told me how she felt about, the NWSN and creating it and why she created it, I just got this warm feeling of, this is for me. This is for me. And this is where I want to go, and this is where I feel empowered to go. So it was unavoidable to go in and just join the NWSN team. It's growing. Every couple of months we get someone new. It's amazing. They just became a 501c3 in 2023. So they're legally young, but the network has been unofficially around for a while. And it's really incredible. It's been a new journey in my career that was unexpected, but much loved and appreciated.
Yeah, it's really beautiful the way it sort of just aligned for you. Could you talk a little bit about what National Women's Shelter Network does and, like, the impact of their work?
Absolutely. There are several things that we do, and they revolve around, one, making sure that shelters have the resources that they need. So often we go in, and shelters are being so brilliant about their budget. They're being brilliant about their programs. They know what works. They just don't have the resources. They don't have the financial resources. Maybe they don't have the grants. Maybe they don't have someone who they can't pay for a grant writer. And so there's just a lot of things that they simply don't have access to. And so we want to give them access to that. We want to give them in-kind donations that are supportive and helpful. Right now I'm working with Amazon to send some hygiene kits to folks in St. Louis who have been devastated by the storms there in the past months. Those hygiene kits take away from someone needing to create those hygiene kits, put them together, spend the money on them. And so it just means that they just have to give them out to the community. And so being able to take that burden off the shoulders of others, to take away certain tasks and give them turnkey, ready to deliver, that's a really important part of the National Women's Shelter Network. There's also the federal legislation part, where we're working on the Women's and Family Protection Act, where we're looking to authorize and appropriate more federal funds for specifically women's shelters and domestic violence shelters, and to expand the definition of what a homeless individual means, and expanding that so that survivors of domestic violence are better able to access resources that are defined for homeless individuals. And so there's that public policy part, education, and bringing folks together for educational convenings. Our conference is a major output of the NWSN, and it's incredible. I was able to partake in it, our second annual conference this last January, and people are so warm and so happy to be with each other. It's just good. And when I go out and visit and I talk to other people in the months after the conference, they just loved that conference in a way that I didn't know that you could love conferences. It's really amazing and really connective. We had folks from Alaska come out. We had folks from Puerto Rico come out. We had folks from Hawaii come out. And it's just deeply important that we're able to share space, share community, and understand what's going on in the ground in different areas, because since people respond to their environments have different factors and different variables. So sometimes the challenges don't all have the same solutions, but if we come together and we talk about what worked for us and how we had to deal with a similar issue and how maybe you can confront that and maybe how it's different in your area, it's finding solutions together. And so those are some major impact and outputs of the NWSN.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys are doing amazing work. I mean, it's like you're tackling different areas and making sure that, like, you're fighting towards, the end of homelessness. And you can see that through, like, all the various works that you're doing. So yeah, thank you guys so much for doing that. And so do you have any final thoughts or words for our audience?
Yeah. I mean, I think people have such a mixed bag approach to homelessness. I talk to people across the political sphere from different countries who have different ideas of what it means to be homeless. And I would just urge people to interact with homeless people more. I think so many of the times people experiencing homelessness feel invisible. I recently had an experience with a man who, he was losing his fingers from untreated diabetes. And we just had this interaction. It was just quick and it was easy. He just got tears in his eyes from being acknowledged as a human being. So please just acknowledge folks as human beings. I think that is part of the social disability that I mentioned previously. It's socially disabling when people don't consider you a human being who has dignity and the same amount of rights that you do as a person.
Thank you so much, Naomi. It was so wonderful having you on and just, speaking about your own experiences, your work at NWSN, and how sexual violence and sex trafficking sort of intertwines with homelessness. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The episode was hosted by me, Hannah Nabraha, produced by Baron Mello. The audio and video editing was done by Ilona Tuominen, and the music is courtesy of Diego Urquela. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to The Bells I Hear and follow us on social media at The Bells I Hear to find more content and to spread the word. Thanks again. Till next time.